welcome to this year's Sappho Award ceremony. And a special welcome to Roger Scruton, the recipient of this year's award. We are very happy and proud to welcome you here today in the Free Press Society. And we have been very much looking forward to this day. The award, the Sappho Award, is given to a person that has shown fearlessness in uncompromising writing. And Roger Scruton definitely fits to this description. But I should leave the motivation to Professor Nicolas Voss. And before I do this, I will just say a few words about this afternoon. As you can see in the program, we start out with a motivation from Professor at Copenhagen Business School, Nicolas Voss. And after that, Roger Scruton will give a speech on free speech and political correctness. And then in the end, there'll be time for Q's and A's to Roger Scruton. And then I should have said now, at this point, that it's possible to buy the only of Roger Scruton's many books that is actually translated into Danish, The Need for Nations, Nationernes Nødvendighed. But it's not, it's sold out there, but it's already sold out, so it's not possible. But that's what a success is like. So I'll leave the floor to you, Nicolas.
Thank you, Katrine. Uses.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted and honored to introduce to you today someone whose work I've admired for a long time and who has influenced my own thinking profoundly and perhaps even my behavior, I suppose, namely Professor Roger Scruton. A visit by Professor Scruton has been long overdue, and I think we should all be immensely grateful to Katrine Winkel Holm for making this happen. As most of you will know, Professor Scruton's visit was originally planned for a date in March. A horse riding accident intervened, which is certainly a very worthy excuse for cancelling for a conservative philosopher who endorses traditional ways of life. Apropos horses, Scruton apparently, and this may be a myth, perhaps you can tell us, Scruton apparently started horseback riding because Enoch Powell told him that any true conservative must engage in fox hunting. And to do that, you need to be capable of riding a horse. And besides, there are few things that upset socialists more than fox hunting. So, in fact, Powell sold Scruton his hunting gear, and the story goes that when someone asked Powell about the hunting clothes, he said, "We're just about the same size, physically, I mean, not intellectually." And the background to this, of course, is that Enoch Powell became a full professor, like Nietzsche, by the way, in his mid-20s, which was then and still is remarkable, and it does things to your ego, of course. Now, anecdotes aside, there are at least two closely related reasons why we should cheer about having Professor Scruton with us today. First of all, Professor Scruton is a true public intellectual of great international standing. In our part of the world, he is no doubt the person who has done most to articulate, and you may even say restore, intellectual conservatism in the tradition from Edmund Burke. And behind this feat is a production of books, pamphlets, magazine and newspaper articles, essays, appearances as a public speaker in settings such as this, but also on BBC TV and BBC Radio. That is simply breathtaking. The productivity is amazing. And Professor Scruton is very much a public philosopher, somewhat perhaps in the tradition of Bertrand Russell or Alfred Ayer. And he has distinguished himself in the wider public by, among other things, defending fox hunting and by mercilessly attacking the oceans of postmodernist nonsense that have been pouring out of the universities of France and the United States. Nonsense that is not just nonsense because it is invading our universities and is increasingly invading our public discourse, influencing politics, And it is doing this because I think it meets the always manifest need for substitute religions, now that traditional Marxism is dead. Now the second reason why we should cheer about this visit, which is, of course, this is what is directly related to the Sappho Award, is that Professor Scruton is a stalwart for freedom of speech. I think this partly reflects what seems to be a penchant for cleverly formulated, often hilarious, in fact, controversial statements. A journalist recently said, tongue-in-cheek, that Professor Scruton is a right-wing polemicist who's been accused over the years of everything from racism to homophobia to probably global warming. He has, at any rate, consistently stood up for the right to free speech, for example, by defending the Nobel Prize winner, medicine, Tim Hunt, when he was recently hounded for making lame but fundamentally harmless, innocent remarks about how cumbersome it can be as a man when you fall in love in science with the gals in the lab, and things may end up, God knows where, in marriage, for example. I'm myself married to a colleague, so I can relate to Sir Tim's remarks in this regard, and I hope I won't be hounded for this remark. Now, Scruton himself was, if not hounded, then he certainly got in bad standing with the politically correct set, when in 1984, as the editor of the Salisbury Review, he published a short article by a headmaster in Bradford, Roy Honeyford. And if you read the piece, you'll see it's a quiet, fundamentally, I'd say, constructive warning against some of the concrete excesses of multiculturalism in parts of the British school system. But this caused a stir. Honeyford was removed as a headmaster. The left side of the political spectrum, including, I surmise, a substantial part of Professor Scruton's colleagues, decided that his level of evil was at the level of Enoch Powell's, and perhaps worse, actually. And his academic career, he says, was then basically over. And for the last 2 decades, perhaps more, he's been fundamentally an independent scholar, writer, part-time farmer. So you may say that he has certainly himself paid the price or the cost of freedom of speech that you may have to bear if you are an articulate, conservative, public intellectual in a politically correct and left-wing climate. So Scruton himself offers quite a principled defense of this freedom in various parts of his work. And such defenses of freedom of speech are, of course, of the utmost importance, given the now constant assaults that are being made on this freedom. These assaults are not isolated incidents. They grow from an ideology. And attacking freedom of speech has become an industry, driven by social justice warrior, by parts of feminism, and by what we may call offense entrepreneurs. People who delight in taking offense and delight in the attention that the very public taking offense brings them. So it's an industry, and it's an industry that's becoming institutionalized as people benefit. There's something in it for them, not just attention, but also often jobs and money. So in US, for example, US universities, there are bias response teams that will check up on politically incorrect speech, whether made by faculty or by students. To give another example, we now have a climate where a Scottish man, I read in The Guardian of all places yesterday, where a Scottish man who has apparently taught his dog to make the Nazi salute faces hate crime charges. Now, the only proper response to such foolishness, which it is, sheer foolishness, is to shrug your shoulder and move on, and let the dog do the Nazi salute, for God's sake. But the offense industry thinks otherwise. A part of the principled defense of free speech is that as a free society, we should not only tolerate extreme opinions, we actually, literally, need extreme opinions to probe the boundaries of our knowledge and push forward. And therefore it will not do if, for example, right-wing opinions are deliberately suppressed in certain parts of academia, as research has conclusively shown is the case. This is not to say that we should necessarily cultivate verbal aggressiveness and that something is worthwhile saying just because it is extreme. That's not the case, of course. And most of the time we literally should just shrug our shoulders and go on with our lives. But the point is that useful extreme opinions cannot be made and cannot thrive in a climate where all purportedly extreme opinions, at least on one side of the political spectrum, are hounded. Well, I'm sure Professor Scruton can address these issues in a much more profound and eloquent manner than I'm capable of, so I'm most happy and pleased to pass the word to today's recipient of the Sappho Award. Thank you.
It's heavy.
Yes, thank you very much. I think I'll keep this to my wife just for the time being. It's probably the only time she's going to get flowers from me. I'm very sorry that I've lost my voice, so I may not be very clear to hear, but I hope you can understand. Anyway, first, let me say how honoured I am to receive this award, and how grateful I am for those very kind words of Professor Voss, which actually seem to me to have said everything that has to be said, in a way, about free speech, that we're under pressure from what is in effect an industry of offence, which is trying not just to silence people like me, but also to claim territory for itself at the expense of others. And I think this is one of the important issues that we need to understand. So let me start from the beginning by asking just what is free speech? What is it exactly? Well, it is obviously a right. It's the right to say what you wish to say, regardless of various things. But regardless of what? And is it a legal right or a moral right? And this is already a question that many of us find difficult to answer. It should be surely a legal right, but it doesn't follow that it's a moral right. There are many things which we have a legal right to do, which we have no moral right to do. I have a legal right to speak angrily to you in this room, but it's not a moral right. I don't want to offend you, and I shouldn't want to offend you. Other actions which people judge to be wrong morally, like, say, adultery, but nevertheless there's a legal right to commit them, because we think that the law should not extend into this private realm in order to confiscate the real moral arguments. But in the case of free speech, we do seem to think that without a legal right that is protected by the law, there's no point that we have really established. We really have to have that legal right if there is to be public discussion about the issues that matter. In some areas, we can protect our right to free speech through civil action. We can bring a case against those who are trying to shut us up. But in many cases, that doesn't seem to be sufficient. If those who are trying to shut us up are anonymous and multitudinous, then it is very difficult to defend ourselves by civil action. So clearly, we ought to have some other means of defence available to us, and that's what thinkers since at least the 19th century have wished that we should have. Some kind of legal protection for things said honestly and openly in the cause of public discussion. John Stuart Mill famously said that the attempt to silence speech is to deprive not only the person who is who is uttering something, but also the person who's attempting to silence him of the truth of the matter under consideration. Scientific advance depends upon exposing our beliefs to refutation, and if we try and protect those beliefs from refutation through the law, then we effectively bring the pursuit of truth to an end. But the question is, though, what exactly does the assault on free speech amount to? In the modern world, the world that we share now, there are many ways in which people can be intimidated, which were not available to our ancestors. For example, not just shouting people down in a lecture hall, but engineering a Twitter storm, because somebody has said something. Is that not a way of intimidating, punishing someone for a remark in a way that we against which we have no defence? Increasingly, we're actually seeing this being used as the way of punishing unorthodox opinions and creating an atmosphere of fear. If you utter the wrong word, it gets around on the internet or through these through Facebook or Twitter or whatever. The case, Professor Voss already mentioned the case of Sir Tim Hunt, who said at a conference in an out-of-the-way place, South Korea, it was a scientific conference, that it is difficult for men and women to share a laboratory because you tend to fall in love with the women, and when you speak to them crossly, they tend to cry. Now, that's not a very sensible thing to say in public, but immediately there was a Twitter storm activated, and you might say, well, so what? I'm not on Twitter, so why does it matter to me? But it does matter because, of course, it then becomes a matter of public concern. In the end, Sir Tim was reprimanded publicly by the Royal Society, of which he's a fellow, and also had to step down from his job in the University of London as a professor. And his wife too had to do something, was compromised in her career. Now, so there are real consequences of these Twitter storms, and in that particular case, you can see how badly institutions behave in order to protect themselves. Once the storm has happened, even the Royal Society, which has no right whatsoever to reprimand any of its fellows, has to go public with an act of dissociation. In my view, he should have sued the Royal Society for defamation, but he didn't, because by then the poor man was hiding under the table somewhere. So we're fairly clear about the need to protect our right of free speech in the sort of areas that are of importance to us in public discussion. But we shouldn't ignore the fact that there are different kinds of beliefs and different kinds of utterance, some of which have a different standing from scientific utterances. We tend to distinguish, at least we ought to distinguish, beliefs that are protected in some way from beliefs that are open to discussion. All religions have made this distinction, and the concept of blasphemy has something to do with this. There are certain things that, according to the religion, you cannot put in question, or if you put them in question, you mustn't do so publicly, because words have effects, and we protect certain of our beliefs because we're worried about the social effect of criticizing them. And this, I think, is a very relevant thing for us today. You can criticize my belief that the earth is spherical, that carbon is an element, or that Shakespeare was not the Earl of Oxford, and I won't feel threatened by you. But if you criticize my belief that Christ died to redeem mankind, or that the Jews are the chosen people, or that the Prophet Muhammad was appointed by God, or if you laugh at these beliefs, then I feel something different. I don't just feel that you're wrong. depending on where I stand in all the various religions, I might feel deeply hurt. I feel that there's something antagonistic has been said. So, in these protected areas, we think that something more is at stake than just the truth or falsity of the belief in question. What is that more that is in stake? Now, it's true that even in scientific areas, people try to protect their beliefs. If you have followed the disputes in American education over whether evolution should be taught in schools, or whether, if it is taught, intelligent design should be taught along with it as a possible alternative. These disputes have become heated in just the way that religious disputes are. Some of the scientific, allegedly purely scientific thinkers get hot under the collar when it comes to the question of intelligent design, saying that thou shalt not teach that to children. It is undermining the manifest truth about the human condition, and therefore disadvantaging them in the world to which they are destined. Now, of course, we know, because Karl Popper has pointed it out so successfully, that the sign of a scientific belief is that it's open to refutation. Somebody who doesn't open his beliefs to refutation is not thinking scientifically. That's the mark of a scientific belief. Therefore, the attempt to protect scientific beliefs removes them from the realm of science and puts them in that other realm of the protected beliefs. But what is it that protective beliefs have in common? What distinguishes them? Obviously, religions have such beliefs at their heart, but even people without religion have protected beliefs. Indeed, it's mostly people without religion who are responsible for the kind of censorship that Professor Voss referred to. People who are post-religious, belong to post-religious communities, but still have just as much need as any pious Muslim for the things that cannot be questioned. It's just that the things that cannot be questioned have changed and are apt to change from one week to the next. So what is it about beliefs that causes people to protect them? I think the principal thing is that they are a sign of membership. They are identity-forming beliefs. You join a community by having these beliefs or by expressing them. You belong with a particular section of humanity, and you enjoy their protection too. So when your self-identity is wrapped up in a belief in that sense, your sense of who you are is also at risk when other people criticize the belief. And the criticizing my beliefs is an assault on me. Instead of judging our beliefs in terms of their truth or falsehood, we judge them in terms of whether they're mine or not mine. But what happens when you take religion away? In effect, you can take religion away from people, but you cannot destroy in them their desire for membership, their desire to be part of something that in some way includes them and protects their thinking from adverse encounters around them. And people still need this sense of identity, even if they have no belief in God and no religious ceremony with which to rehearse it. They still claim it. And this is essentially what has happened in our time, I think, that we have found the emergence after the dwindling of Christian faith of negative identities. People make for themselves identities which are not built around what they are for, but what they're against. And this phenomenon rose very much to the top of the European experience in the 20th century, where with communism and Nazism and so on, in which new identities were on offer, for which you could claim purely on the strength of what you hated. If you hated the Jews, you're a long way along the path of becoming a proper Nazi and enjoying the protection that it offered. Likewise, if you hated the bourgeoisie, you got a long way along that identity which was offered by the Communist Party. Now, all those totalitarian ways of giving people identity have vanished more or less from the possibilities available to people. But there are other negative identities that are still clearly available nevertheless. And this is essentially what we've seen emerging in universities, what one might call the victim identities. If you can claim identity with a victim group, whatever that group might be, claim its history of persecution as defining your position, you've gained an enormous advantage in the competition for scarce resources, especially in the academic world. We've seen this obviously with feminism, which has its roots in perfectly legitimate speculations from the Enlightenment onwards about the relation between men and women and their distinct roles in society, and the validity or otherwise of the way in which women have been treated. But in American universities from the 1960s onwards, feminism, instead of becoming a form of rational reflection on the condition of women, became a negative identity. You joined the feminist movement by way of identifying with women as victims of men, of course. And then out of that negative identity, all kinds of beliefs emerged. For example, the belief that the family is a patriarchal organisation in which men exert control over women in order to reproduce. They're using women as slaves in order to generate children who will be advancing their social power and so on. Those beliefs that emerged then out of the negative identity became beliefs which were protected. You couldn't question them. And I think you will find in many American universities today courses of so-called gender studies in which are built around these protected beliefs which cannot be questioned. Beliefs about the nature of men, what they do to women, and so on, which are truths which are immovable. So this invention of victim classes and then claiming membership of them, I think is an extremely important tool in the hands of people who don't have the support of a religion, but nevertheless need an identity. The victim identity is an identity which you can define against the surrounding order. You're standing up for the oppressed against all these comfortable people who have taken all the rewards from you, and you are entitled, therefore, to move aggressively against your surroundings. It's not for your own sake you're doing this; it's for the sake of women or gays, or now it's transsexuals. It's whatever it might be, the cause of the moment. So you can justify your indignation in this way without actually paying the cost of it, because after all, you've never yourself been a victim. You're a well-funded member of the middle classes with a free education in a university and all the rest. But nevertheless, you can claim an advantage over the people competing with you for the rewards of the academic life by identifying in this way with the victims. Now, as I say, all human beings need identities, an identity in that sense. Living as a pure individual, according to Enlightenment standards of rational thought, putting every matter to the question, this is jolly hard. That's what we think a university is for, of course, that hard work, hard form of life in which you put everything to the test of critical argument. But it's not something that most of us are capable of. So, and certainly not the mass of the students who enter a university in that fragile period of life when you are looking for an identity of your own. So it's not surprising that these negative identities flourish on university campuses, in particular among students who have nothing, who want nothing when they come there, nothing materially, except something like this. So why does this lead, though, to this assault on free speech everywhere? I think the crucial matter to grasp is that when it comes to a protected belief, it's not the falsehood of what the other person says that upsets you, it's the truth. It's only truth, therefore, that is censored. But we see this, obviously in the famous case of the church and Galileo. Galileo wouldn't have mattered at all to the church had he been pouring out obvious falsehoods about the heavens and the relation of the sun to them and so on, and to the earth. But it's because he was saying true things that he had to be shut up. Likewise, anybody who raises in an objective, philological frame of mind the question of the origin of the Quran, he has to be shut up, because the truth about it is incompatible with all kinds of things upon which people have built a way of life. Likewise with the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century that shut up all their critics, what their critics were saying was objectionable because of its truth. And so if you build your life on a falsehood, you must fight to the death against the truth. And I think this is what we see even with these little negative victim identities that I've been referring to. There is a fight to the death about those things upon which identities have been built. And there's a real question for our civilization as to whether we can live with the open Enlightenment frame of mind that doesn't allow these fights to the death, which says, that's your problem if you feel that about this belief, and learns to laugh at it. So we experience the same need, as I say, for identity-forming beliefs, and when we find them, we protect them. But the question is, how are they protected, and is there a way of undoing the protection so that we can expose some of these beliefs to critical argument and at least not suffer the cost of being censored and outcast and even violently attacked for our raising the question of them. Now, I think we need to look back over the recent 20 or 30 years of history and the rise of political correctness in this context. Political correctness is obviously a way of attacking communities on behalf of potential victim classes. And it has gone hand in hand with radical censorship. First of all, the invention of isms and phobias. This is a very significant thing that has happened in my lifetime. It began with the invention of the concept of racism. Now we all know that there is such a thing as believing that a given race or community of human beings has properties different from another one, and maybe is superior to the other one, and maybe justifies therefore the superior race taking over. We all know from the history of colonialism that there are ways of thinking about other sections of humanity that are demeaning of them, and that we ought not to indulge in. And so that there is something, it's a real historical truth that we're referring to, including obviously the truth of slavery and the more brutal forms of colonialism. But when the word racist became a standard accusation against people in superior positions in our society, it wasn't that was being criticised. That was long in the past, all that. What was being criticised was usually a word that had been used wrongly, the revelation of an attitude that could be, when properly examined, regarded as a heresy. It was a genuine witch hunt, which involved penalising people for having raised questions. Even Professor Voss referred to the Hungerford case that I was involved in my country, where a mild-mannered, gentle but patriotic headmaster raised the question as to whether we were treating our immigrant communities rightly by regarding their culture as untouchable. Shouldn't we be in our school introducing their children to the culture here that they're destined to be in, rather than letting them absorb beliefs and customs which, quite frankly, we regard as unacceptable? It's a perfectly reasonable thing to ask, but that was racism. It was racism because it was making a distinction which had adverse implications for the society that he was writing about. But once racism got going, all sorts of other isms and phobias came in the wake of it. I'm just to take the case of Islamophobia. This extraordinary mental disease occurred suddenly in the whole of the Western world on September the 10th in 2001. September 11th, 2001. Suddenly it was there. Hadn't been there before. And we have to ask ourselves, why did this disease suddenly appear? And why were we all guilty of it? Of course, because it served a very useful purpose, which was to prevent open and free discussion of what had happened on that day, and what it was about Islam, if anything, which motivated people to act in that way. So since then we've had lots of other isms and phobias, and you've had them here in Denmark too. In fact, Scandinavian people are even more quick than Anglo-Saxons to pick this up. Homophobia is a mental crime here, just as it is in my country. It's just that you don't know how to commit it. Because if you as we had to open discussion about whether there should be gay marriage in our country, it was never explained to us at the time when we began this discussion that if you took one side of it, that accused you automatically of homophobia. So it's clear that you can fall into that crime just like that, because the definition is constantly shifting. I was brought up in Cambridge University in the post-war period, in which it was perfectly normal, of course, that people engaged in that sort of activity. I was judged adversely because I differed from the surroundings in three important respects. I was lower class, right-wing, and heterosexual. And that combination in Cambridge of my day was regarded as so vulgar that I was almost outside the reach of polite discourse. But nevertheless, nobody would have thought that this was grounds for censoring what I had to say when we discussed these issues. Of course not. It was all part of the surrounding world. It was only much later that suddenly it became impossible to discuss the issue of homosexuality without committing this undefined crime. Nobody knows when the word phobia is used. Nobody respects its ancient Greek meaning, which means fear. It's come to mean now irrational hatred of somebody on some particular grounds. Something which, had I had that irrational hatred as a young man, I'd have had no friends. And it's still true today, I guess. So this invention of labels is a very important part of political correctness. And it's part of a more general custom, which is that of controlling the speech around a particular issue. If we can control the speech around that issue, it becomes impossible to have more than one view of it. And George Orwell anticipated this very brilliantly in his famous novel 1984, which I'm sure most of you know, when he invented the idea of newspeak, that the party controlling the society of that imagined totalitarian state invented a language in which only the things acceptable to the party could be expressed. There wasn't any room for disagreement anymore, because newspeak simply erased the words used that might be used to express disagreement. And I think that's to some extent what we're seeing in political correctness, taking away the words that we might use in order to express disagreement. In the case of homosexuality, obviously, that word has been taken away. You have to use a word like gay instead. And again, in the discussion of relations with the Islamic world, the language is very carefully controlled. There are things that you cannot say and things that you can't say. And we've had a recent example of this, that the language is constantly changing in order to prevent new things being said. This is the case of Germaine Greer, who came to speak in one of our universities. Now, she was one of the original radical feminists who believed that that men really are oppressive, that women as a sex have lived under the thumb of the other sex, the unfair sex, which is mine, and that she has made her life out of propagandizing this and showing the extent to which the male is assumed as the dominant cultural figure in our literature, painting, music, and so on. And of course, she has cast an awful lot of light on our literary tradition in this way. I mean, she's very much respected, of course, as an outspoken literary figure. But she, giving a university lecture at some point on this, touched on the transgender issue, and didn't realise that she should be using the word gender and not the word sex. And she said that men are of one sex and women of another sex, and the fact that a man thinks that he's a woman doesn't mean he's of the female sex. Has she used the correct language and said that the fact that he thinks he's of the female gender means that he is of the female gender, that would have been all right. But she fell off the edge of the permitted forms of expression and used the word sex properly, and of course exposed what was lurking behind the word gender, namely the desire to make everything a matter of choice, to spread freedom into all the areas where freedom is impossible. And so she unwittingly exposed the lie behind a new version of the sexual war. And as a result, she became the latest target for censorship. No platform can be offered to her because she's shown this disrespect for the possibility of transgender identity. She is guilty of transphobia, and that word is now in the vocabulary, you might we'll have to see just what its subsequent history will be. But anyway, one thing that has been achieved by that particular movement, the radical feminist movement in our universities, is in effect to get rid of the word sex. Because sex refers to a biological fact, which we can't deny, it interferes with the freedom and the aspirations of those people who want to deny it. It's created a new victim class, the class of the people who can't stand the truth about biology, human biology. So it has been replaced by the word gender, And now you will see on all official forms, the word sex doesn't appear. In my passport, I'm of male gender. Insofar as I've ever thought about what gender I am, I have thought, well, it would be nice to be more feminine than I am. That does seem like something that you can choose. But as for my sex, no. So this here is a way in which total obscurity has entered into an issue which is of vital importance to all human beings, which is sexual identity, by confiscating the very word with which it could be expressed, the word sex. We have got to a very strange position with this this kind of political correctness, and there's a real question of what we might do about it. I think Professor Voss has touched on this, and I will just say a few words in conclusion. We all recognise that, as I said at the beginning, that it's morally wrong to give gratuitous offence to people. We can't say that we're within our moral rights if we insult people or laugh at their religion or whatever it might be. But the point is not about morality, it's about legality. We still need a legal order in which people are free to do that if we are to explore the possibilities available to us, and also if we are to resolve our conflicts. Many of our conflicts today are about protected beliefs. They are about people wanting to stop discussion of issues. And we are living in a society where there are issues arising which really must be discussed. In particular, of course, the religion, the contest between Islamic and Christian or post-Christian worldviews. It has got to be discussed, otherwise we won't know where we are or how to incorporate new communities, how to reconcile ourselves to their way of life, and so on. But at the moment, we're in a position of ossified silence about this matter of such importance to us. So although it's morally wrong to give offence, it should be legally permissible. On the other hand, there's a further problem, and as Professor Voss remarked, there's a new kind of person emerging who's expert in taking offence. In fact, gender studies in our universities is a kind of 3-year concentrated discipline in taking offence. And whatever you say, somebody will step in and accuse you of this. And the Hunt case is just one example. And I think we will see more and more examples of this kind. So we have to recognise that we're in a society where people are essentially taking offence for a purpose. It's the cost-free way of gaining superiority over your interlocutor. If you can say, what you said has offended me, I'm offended as a woman, a gay, or whatever I might choose to identify myself as, you've got the upper hand without paying the genuine cost of that, which is having a good argument. And so this is a really serious assault on rationality in public discourse. And the answer to it, as I see it, is not to be intimidated and to laugh at the person who takes offence. We do have to cultivate the sense of humour. This is the thing that eventually cured us of Puritanism. In the 17th century, laughter was very difficult in Britain, even more difficult in Massachusetts. But gradually, people learned to laugh at it. Butler's famous poem Hudibras, which mocked the Puritans of 17th century England, did us a tremendous amount of good. And gradually American literature learned to laugh at this. And I think that tradition of satire is a precious achievement of our civilization. But it's interesting that it's precisely our disposition to laugh at the absurdities of radical Islam which is now being silenced by everyone. By them and by the politically correct on behalf of them. So this is where the fight begins, and all I can say is that prominent among those who fought this fight was, of course, the Free Speech Society here, which has suffered for it, but nevertheless is setting an example to us all. I guess this is the point where I should end, because I've looked through my repertoire of jokes for one that can be told that would be suitable to end on, and I couldn't find one. The matter is far too serious. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger Scruton. And now we have some time for questions and comments to Mr. Scruton. And anybody who wants to say something, please start with saying who you are. And if you've got the chance, make it brief. Yes.
Thanks for a very interesting speech. First of all, I would like to apologize for the architecture in here, since I know you have different preferences of what beauty is. Sorry for that. I have this question. My name is Adam, and some intellectuals have argued that we have left the postmodern era of thinking and entered a new one. Do you agree with that? And if so, what do you think characterized this new era of thinking?
Well, I've never myself been very happy with the word postmodern. It seemed to me to be simply a way of saying we're no longer interested in these great modern thinkers and we're looking for something else to arrive. But my view is it didn't arrive, and that really one must reaffirm the modern era, which began for me with the Enlightenment and is continuous right down to our day. It's true, of course, that there are new things arriving, and one of them, which I very much regret, is the downgrading of thought by mass communication. As it becomes easier and easier to communicate your thoughts to each other, we spend less and less time on making them accurate and honing them, polishing them so that they will be listened to. You know, the great literature that we inherited was literature meant to communicate a permanent message to somebody whom you couldn't speak to. We used the written word to make sure we got things right, and paper was expensive. Writing was an energy-intensive thing, so people worked very hard on their communications in the literate days. But I think you can recognise now from the speech of young people that they work less hard.
Well, first of all, thank you for coming here and thank you for giving us this lecture. My name is Mads Holger. I'm a columnist here in Denmark. And I'd like to ask you, especially intrigued by your words on building your identity in a negative way, so to speak. Well, certainly many of us here do that, and perhaps even in this community in particular, if you don't mind me saying so, because we all seem to be anti-Muslim today. However, having said that, how many of us are really Christian? And that really seems to be a big concern of mine. How much are we pro our own identity, our own culture, and how much do we really tend to cultivate our own culture? I find that to be one of the biggest problems. And I would like to ask you, having said that, how do you find that we really need to build this culture up again? Because you tend to have a lot of bad things to say about feminists, how these victimized cultures tend to influence academia in particular and the debate as a whole. And I tend to disagree. I tend to agree. Don't misunderstand me. But how do we really build up our own culture? Because my view in this seems to be that I'm actually more afraid. No, I'll be brief. Excuse me. But I tend to be more afraid of the sycophants rather than the Spartans, if you don't mind me saying so. So that's basically my question. What do you fear the most?
Okay. I agree with you that if we have no positive thing to put in the place of what we're criticising, then of course we're not in a position to teach young people other than what they're absorbing from their environment. I think what I was criticizing was what I call the culture of repudiation. Feminism has, as part of it, that culture of repudiation, repudiating something that we ought actually to be inheriting. That's to say, the open discussion about the relation between the sexes that has been going on since the 17th century at least, and which has led to the revised forms of marriage and the family. All that is perfectly acceptable. But the thing that I reject is a form of identity that's based purely on rejection of what we are. It's the rejection of things that belong to our first person plural. Now, identifying that first person plural and reaffirming it is the great problem that confronts everybody in the Western world today. It's easy for a committed Christian who accepts the full metaphysical doctrine of the faith and the way of life of the faith to reaffirm at least that. It's much harder for everybody else because the norm in Western societies today is a post-Christian norm. Let's say people remain attached to the Christian faith and its vision of moral order, but want to distance themselves from quite a lot of the metaphysical underpinning of it. But therefore you have to find another way of affirming it. And that, I think, has been the search of Western civilization since the Enlightenment. We're seeking to affirm from a position of doubt the certainties that remain. And for us they're enough, and for me they're enough. But of course, to do this purely negatively, as you say, is to give up on the real contest.
Thank you. My name is Lars Hedegaard. I used to be president of the Free Press Society. Now I'm living in the provinces. I had a conversation a few days ago, a couple of weeks ago, with an Englishman who claimed to have had a conversation with you, Professor Scruton. And he referred to a remark that you were supposed to have said, namely that if we are to be successful in fighting off the Islamic onslaught, we will in the process become as bad and depraved and brutalized as the ones we are fighting against. Is that true? Is that your opinion? And if that is your opinion, is it worthwhile fighting Islam?
Well, I can't think who this person is, but if I did say it, I mean, I say different things at 10 o'clock at night from what I say in the daytime, especially depending on the quality of the wine. But I would say that it certainly is not my opinion at this moment. I think in the confrontation with radical Islam, it's obvious that we should be in the business of setting an example. And of course, we have a very important example before us of turning the other cheek and so on. But we also have to be firm. We can't simply say, we forgive you for all this attack on us. No, we don't. We think that you're in the wrong, and this is why you're in the wrong. And if you want us to change our behaviour, you've got to come forward and speak out and let us speak back at you. That's what I would like to see. And it's up to the Muslim communities to appoint those spokesmen. It's unfortunately Islamic law has no position of the spokesman that it can identify. So there are real difficulties. But until they come forward and begin negotiations, we have to be as firm as possible in saying that we want to hear what you have to say, and that maybe it will come, maybe it won't.
My name is Rune. I'm also a columnist. Recently you published a book about the new left, which criticizes in particularly continental European philosophy. Why is it that you can say the most destructive ideas of postmodernism or leftism is most profound in Britain, perhaps also US, and not continental Europe?
I think, well, it's a very complicated question. This, and what, as I read the history, what happened was in the post-war period in France and Germany, there was this huge reaction against the Second World War, and a search for some identity that will give the intellectual the right and the duty to speak to the people and say what the truth was. And Sartre took advantage of this, and his wife Simone de Beauvoir as well. And these, and to some extent, the Frankfurt School in Germany. So there was a kind of flight towards Marxism, and Marxism became incorporated into a new way of looking at things. And it was, again, a negative philosophy. It was all about hatred of the bourgeoisie who had betrayed Europe into this conflict. In May 1968, the successors of Sartre took over, not in universities, because universities don't matter in France. It's cafes and places like that, and also beds. And so the Foucault and Deleuze and Guattari and those people, pushed the old geezers out of the bed, and they were there instead. But it was all routinized leftist ways of thinking. We in Britain didn't quite have the same experience of the war, obviously, and we didn't have the same vision of intellectuals. The British people have always regarded thinking as a moral fault, and there were a few historians who took up the Marxist way of life, way of thinking, but for the most part, people were too shy to do that. And I think then suddenly, however, in the wake of '68. People in the universities, especially in America, wanted they acquired this kind of envy of the French and the French intellectuals in particular, their position in society, their ability to dominate the media, to find exotic words and incomprehensible paragraphs with which to beat down the ordinary man. The American professors took this on board in a big way and established these journals which consist entirely of second-hand nonsense, with footnotes to French and German literature.
Thank you. My name is John Eric, and I'm writing on political freedom. So I have a question to this anti-conservative worldview that you describe in terms of political correctness and so on. Is it possible, do you think, that it's not a negative project, but that the positive side of it could be egalitarianism, or in the sense of sameness? That what they attack is that the conservative view will insist on differences between sexes and religions and so on, and that the basic feeling on the other side is a longing for sameness and the end of conflicts.
I think that's a profound observation, that underlying political correctness there might be the latest wave of egalitarian sentiment, that it's distinction that we're against, making distinctions. However, that only, in my view, exacerbates the problem, because that is what thinking is, making distinctions, distinguishing the true and the false, the good and the evil, the strong and the weak, the handsome and the ugly, and so on. Learning how to make distinctions without offending people is what civilization really is. And if you think that the only way to talk and to deal with others is by removing all distinctions, addressing them from a position of total flatness, then you're removing individuality too. You're not really addressing the other. Everything is collapsing into a single thought, the universal thought of humanity, namely that we don't really distinguish ourselves from each other.
Hello, my name is Samuel. I'm a history student, and I've been grappling with a problem, I guess. The whole question about free speech and political correctness, the defense is always from the anti-PC side, is always we need free speech, everything goes. But from my reading of it and from most anthropological studies, it shows that we always have some sort of need for taboos and so on. So I'm wondering, when we defend free speech, are you really saying we want to replace current taboos with new taboos? And if we don't say that, aren't we really kidding ourselves? That will inevitably happen at some point.
Yeah, that's to a great extent that is true. That you're absolutely right that there are taboos, and there have to be taboos, and they have to be part of the moral order. That's really what I was saying at the beginning. You know, we don't have a moral right to say anything. We've got to respect other people's sense of what cannot be said, and that's essentially what good manners and delicacy consist in. But I'm really talking about the legal order within which that moral order occurs. To what extent should that protect free speech? It can't lean over backwards to respect all taboos, and our legal order does not. You know, and of course there are conflicting taboos, as we know. But when the word taboo entered English, and every other language actually, it was as a result, as I'm sure you know, of the 19th century anthropology and the discovery of this completely different moral order in Polynesia, the order of pollution and taboo. It's Mary Douglas, I think, who first used that phrase, and the sense that, you know, there is another way of doing things where we regard the moral life as the pursuit of purity and the avoidance of contamination. This is very relevant, obviously, to our confrontation with Islam, because many Islamic sects are in that frame of mind. For them, pollution and taboo are much more important than doctrines of the equality of human beings or human rights or whatever. So we have to learn to deal with that. But we ourselves, post-Enlightenment, you know, we can see that as a constant eroding of taboos, constantly bringing these things into public discourse and talking about them. And I guess we're not really creating new taboos. We're trying to subject all taboos to examination with a view to living at peace, you know, with people who disagree with us. And I this touches on something which I do find very difficult to have a clear view about. That I want to say that the answer to these deep conflicts is discussion. But if the conflict is between us who like discussing things and others who can't discuss them, then that isn't the solution. So you know, we have to think just how far we can get with open discussion and what danger points we're to negotiate along the way.
Thank you. My name is Kasper Støvring, and I'm a writer and columnist. You've been skeptical towards universal human rights, the bastard brood of monsters, to use Jeremy Bentham's words, or at least you've been skeptical towards human rights conventions, and I agree with you. But the counter-argument goes that if we suspend these conventions, it will destabilize the system of rule of law that has governed the Western nations since the Second World War. What do you think about this argument?
I think, these questions are quite difficult. Couldn't you have given me a less educated audience? It's really annoying. I would say that since the Second World War, we started off with Eleanor Roosevelt's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which began quite encouragingly in the tradition of Locke and Montesquieu and the 18th century thinkers about constitutional issues and the founding fathers of America. Rights, as in the American Bill of Rights, they are fundamentally vetoes. I have a right to something means that I can veto you're interfering with that thing. So my freedom of movement is something that you cannot stop. It will be protected against you if you try to stop it. But these are what some people call liberty rights or negative rights. But by something like section, I think, 22 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in her excitement, she was putting in all kinds of other things, like the right to health care, the right to a secure life compatible with the development of my dignity. And what kind of thing is that? That's not a veto on you. It's a claim against you. It's asking you to give up your time and energy so that I can enjoy life just as much as you. So it's shifted in a socialist direction, and it's a philosophical shift from freedom to claim. And we know in the law that there's a distinction between freedoms and claims. Claims require a history. I've got a claim against you for £1,000 because your cow damaged my corn, but it's the history that gives me that claim. But to make claims with no history of individual relations is to essentially invent a duty that I'm imposing on you out of nothing. And that, I think this is the problem that has gone wrong with these universal declarations of rights and the courts that enforce them, that there is no secure philosophy underpinning them anymore. Anybody can invent one. And especially if it's an international court, like the European Court of Human Rights. The judges in that court don't pay the cost of their decisions. In a national court, the judges do pay the cost because they've inflicted it on the community which elected them, or on the legal system which is responsible for their eminence, and so on. So judges are much more careful and much more answerable in a national court and don't invent things just like that. But we've seen this massively creative regime of human rights in Europe as a result of this unwise provision that judges can be appointed there and not removed, and appointed from elsewhere. This is not a complete answer to your question, but it is one explanation of why people are increasingly suspicious of the human rights idea.
I'm very happy to be here today and to be here in the Press Society. My name is Margrethe Hosman. I'm a Lutheran pastor, which means I am preaching every Sunday. I preach God's word to people who don't like it. I think you're right about the victimization. It will go on and on and on. And as you perhaps know, Sweden is the far most advanced society in that respect. My oldest friend actually is a Swede. She was called Kirstin. Now she's called Richard. Her friend Lisa was earlier named Johan, I believe. Now she's called Lisa. No, she's called. She was Lisa. She became Johan. And in Sweden there is a law that says that if you want to change your gender, you must be operated. You must be sterilized. She didn't want it because she wanted to be a man who were incapable of becoming children, of having children. Yes. And I have a comment on that. They hate most of all. What they hate most of all is Christianity. What God says, God created man. God created them as a man and a woman. They feel very much more they have kindred spirits are the radical Muslims who want to kill them much more than the Christians, who are a majority, which I don't think so, which I don't think they are. But this victimization may go on and on and on and on. And what they hate most of all is the Christian enforcement of God's law. And of course, I don't see enlightenment as the beginning of modern times, but the Lutheran Reformation.
Well, that's a very interesting intervention, because it gives a concrete case of the victim culture. And what I would say in response to this is that, of course, there are people who do have these problems with their sexual identity, and the social pressures are difficult for them. They have to take measures, but the real question is, having done so, have they a right to make us revise our entire conceptual scheme and our conception of the human condition in order to not to give offence to them? This is the problem. There's a kind of dictatorship of the victim here, many of us, each of us has some kind of victim class that he belongs to. I belong to the class of intellectual conservatives. There is no greater sufferers than us. We are the target of abuse from every angle, in every sphere, and yet I don't make a thing about it. I know that's something it's my cross. I have to bear it.
We are running out of time, but we have 2 questions left.
My name is Leif Knudsen. Islam offers a systematic oppression of women. I know that you're not a psychiatrist. Can you offer an explanation why Western feminists identify with the Islamic ways and their cause?
Well, I don't think all feminists do, but those that do, I think it's fairly obvious why. They are in the negative frame of mind. They're against Western patriarchy. The Islamists are against Western civilization. Therefore, let's not criticize the Islamists. They're on our side. We're in alliance mode with them. I think we saw this with Ken Livingstone, the first mayor of London, the Labour Party radical, that when he organised rallies, which he did just about every weekend. One weekend it would be the gay activists, the next it would be the radical mullahs from the mosques who wanted to kill the gay activists. But he never put them on the same platform, but he agreed with both of them, because both of them were against the powers that be in England. And I think that is... We just have to recognise that this negative identity is the thing that people opt for once they've lost that belief in the positive that the gentleman over there was referring to, the belief that our civilization is worth defending. But of course, about Islam and women, you have to be careful. Shiites don't have the same view of this as Sunnis. They do, on the whole, believe in one man, one woman in a marriage. They don't have multiple wives, or rarely. And in places like the Levant, like Syria, it would be regarded as outrageous to have 3 wives. And likewise, in Turkey, it was Ataturk, who was a secular character, insisted that the law should only recognise at most one wife, and I think that it's only a narrow sphere of Islamic thinking, namely the bit that hasn't accepted the modern world at all, which endorses the oppression of women. Unfortunately, most Muslim migrants and refugees come from those places where their philosophy is triumphant. And you know why? Because they are horrible, those places. So we're going to get more of the reactionary, bigoted kind of Islam than we will get of the civilized, open kind of Islam that you see in Iran and Turkey.
And then the last question.
My name is Christian. I'm a math student. One of my favorite quotes by you is, I heard during an interview, you said that the left thinks you're evil while you merely think they are wrong. And I think that's a general problem we have, and you talked about it also, that the left seems to think we're evil. And that's the base argument all the time. And every time arguments fail, it boils down to that we are the evil guys.
Yeah.
And then the tail end of this great talk and this good discussion, we should be able to go into society and try to change these behavior, right? But how do we have the discussion with people who think we are basically evil? And I think these opinions are basically evil. And that not being political correct is an expression of being evil and wanting to hurt people.
Yes.
How do we overcome that?
We can overcome it intellectually by recognizing what it really is, namely an attempt to silence discussion, because the left always think that their identity is at stake, not the truth or falsehood of a proposition, and so we're always in an identity conflict with them, and that I think is very difficult. It's very difficult to know what to do, and I think, let me say, well, one possible response is to ask, say, why do you think that opinions can be evil? What is it about them that makes them so? And why don't you think that yours are evil when they cause such tension with people who are offering you only friendship? Can you not give an account that really distinguishes our two lots of opinions, which explains why mine are to be avoided and yours are so righteous? But another response is to use classical terms of abuse. That's what a prig says, a self-righteous person. H.L. Mencken gave this a lovely definition of the Puritan as the person who fears that somewhere someone might be happy. You likewise, the self-righteous person is someone who fears that somewhere someone might actually disagree with him. So this is an expression of your fear. So I think confronting such people in that way is probably the right thing. But it is true that there's a kind of ratchet effect. The left is always advancing even though it doesn't really know what it thinks. And if it knew what it thought, then of course it wouldn't be so afraid of expressing it and of you expressing your difference.
That will be the last word today. Thank you to this very well-educated audience, and thank you to Nicolas Voss for the speech, and thank you Roger Scruton for this thought-provoking analysis of victim identity. Tonight you had the chance to see an interview in Deadline with Roger Scruton and a very surprisingly polite Martin Krasny. I was there, I can witness it. The next meeting in the Free Press Society takes place in Bornholm, the People's Meeting Folkemøde, where we have the speaker, and his name is so hard to pronounce, Hamed Abdel Samad, who will speak on the so-called Prophet Muhammad. But thank you.
Thank you.